and welcome to our Creators Assemble. We actually have a job spotlight interview. I am still co-founder Moni Barrett of Creators Assemble, and today we have Random House Graphics Publishing Director Gina Gagliano. Did I say it right?
Yep.
Woo! Along with Random House Graphics Senior Editor Whitney Leopard to discuss non-traditional jobs in publishing and editing. How are you both doing today?
We're doing great.
Good for a quarantine day?
Yep.
The weather looks nice, at least. It's not too hot or cold.
I mean, I'm currently in New York, so now my apartment, it's the New York winter heat. So it's either my apartment's super hot because the landlord has the heat on, or it's super cold because there's no heat on.
Oh my goodness, you're at the whim.
And, you know, my sweater is like not quite all the way zipped up to the neck, which is how you know it's like slightly bearable here.
Yeah.
Hey, it's gotten under the hundreds out here. We're still having continued fire season, and I'm wearing pants instead of shorts, so it's almost like a fall.
It is in the 40s here.
Yeah.
Nice. So whatever order you want to go in, if you guys could take turns in giving us brief introductions, a little bio of yourselves, and anything that you want to share with our audience.
All right. Gina, go first.
Okay, great. So my current career path, I definitely was the kind of kid who always wanted to work in publishing. But when I was a kid, I didn't have much access to comics because my parents didn't read them. Our local bookstore, our local library didn't have any comics in them. Like really the only way I saw comics was through the newspaper. But I did have access to a lot of books at that local bookstore and that local library. And, you know, reading those books, I came to realize that there was such a thing as careers in publishing. You know, I remember the book I was reading, when I realized like, this book has a lot of spelling errors and like, it must be someone's job to be responsible for that. I bet I could do that better than this person who has been responsible for this book. That is not at all the kind of job that I have now. We have copy editors who are like solely responsible for making sure that we're spelling things right. And I always kind of say like, you know, working in, you know, editorial and marketing and design, there's always this like, everything has to be spelled perfectly, but like, basically that's not really our jobs. Like we have other people who cross-check that for us. You know, so I went from there to, you know, as a kid being a science fiction fantasy reader. And one of the things that happens a lot in science fiction fantasy is that, you know, authors write long afterwards to their books. There's a lot of Q&As in the back, and kind of through this additional matter in books, I realized that there were people who worked with the author behind the scenes, and kind of got a little bit of a sense of who they were and even like what some of their names were and what the different jobs were. And I was just hooked on working in books and being in publishing. You know, from there, I went to college. I got into comics in college because my college had a comics library, and, you know, really fell into this medium and really loved all of the books that I was reading. So I got some internships, and then my first job officially in the business was doing marketing and publicity for First Second, which is Macmillan's graphic novel imprint.
Nice.
So I started there 6 months before they started publishing everything, and you know, worked there for about 15 years, and then came over here to Random House to be the publishing director over here. And in the meantime, have done a lot of very miscellaneous kind of volunteer work, working with festivals. Right now, I'm the co-chair of the comics vertical at the Brooklyn Book Festival, but I've worked with the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art. I've worked with TCAF. I've worked with San Diego Comic-Con on their library and educator library-based programming. You know, and a lot of different stuff, which has been kind of a theme of my career in, doing the job, but also like reaching out and making connections and like meeting people in all sorts of different spaces. What about you, Whitney?
Yeah, as a kid, I didn't want to be in publishing. I wanted to be a psychologist because I watched a lot of Frasier, and I saw this guy who had a really nice apartment and with a grand piano in the living room and would drink sherry with his brother, and I was like, that looks like a nice future that I want to have. And I originally went to college for psychology before I realized that it's not something that I wanted to do, and I actually transferred to art school where I majored in sequential art because I was always a fan of comics. And so I wanted to learn how to make comics. And so I went to art school to learn how to make comics. And while I was there, I learned about editorial and that it was a job people could have. Um, and it was something that I became really interested in because like I love comics, but what I love most about comics is how they come together. And it was one of those things talking to like a teacher being like, it's not necessarily that like I have a passion to make them as much as I want to see them come together. Like what's a job that can make that happen? And he pointed me towards editorial. And whenever I graduated, I lucked out that I was able to get an internship out in Los Angeles, which then led to getting my first job as an assistant editor at Boom Studios, which is a direct market comic book publisher. And I worked there as an assistant before I moved up to eventually running their Kaboom all ages imprint, and worked there for a while. And then Gina reached out to me, oh my gosh, 2 years ago at this point, to tell me about this new imprint that she was launching here at Random House, and it seemed like a really cool opportunity. I had always been interested in learning more about how book publishers did things, but how book publishers did things specific to comics and graphic novels. And so I joined the team, and I am here now.
Very nice. So you kind of mentioned, Whitney, why comics for you, but Gina, I mean, you built this whole imprint, and why, as a hardcore bibliophile, why comics and graphic novels?
Well, I mean, I love reading them. So I feel like working in a space that I really love personally is important. But I also think that it is one of the most interesting parts of the publishing industry right now, where new imprints are starting all the time. There are more debut authors in graphic novels, and especially in kids' graphic novels, than anywhere else. Things are changing all the time as far as what kinds of books are really succeeding, what people are interested in. It also is a space that very much celebrates queer and BIPOC representation in a different way than any other part of the book medium. And it also just has an industry around it with booksellers, teachers, librarians, creators who are really excited and engaged and passionate about the medium. And I feel like that makes it the most fun to work with.
You are not wrong. And Whitney, why for you? Why kids comics? Like when you were doing Kaboom, and now you're interested in this. Like what?
So that was something I stumbled into. Originally, I remember going to whenever I had my first interview with Boom, and whenever I got a call being like, "Hey, we're interested in interviewing you," and I was like, "Great! Like, what imprint are you interviewing?" Because they have 4 imprints. And I was like, "What imprint?" And they're like, "Kaboom!" And it was like the one imprint I had no idea what they were doing because at the time I was reading very like adult comics and horror and thriller and crime.
That's
And
me.
and I lucked out at the time that like I had a roommate who was just like, she was a huge fan of kids comics. So I remember being like, "Hey, do you have any books by Kaboom?" And she like just pulls out 2 short boxes from underneath her bed, and it's like, "Here you go. Here's everything you can read." And I got to learn about like the kids comics, and the thing that impressed me specifically with what Boom was doing, which is why I got really excited working there, was that their kids comics were still very much like, they didn't talk down to children. It was just like, hey, we expect, like, kids are smart, kids understand things, we trust kids to be able to get these stories, and we're not going to talk down to them. And that was something where I was just like, if I'm going to work on kids comics, I want to work on kids comics like this. And so that's something that I fell in love with. And then as I continued to work with kids comics, I realized just so much stuff you could do and so many stories that you can tell. And so that it kind of became my passion, and thus I will never leave kids comics, most likely.
Very nice. So kind of getting into the meat of what we're here to discuss from the creator's perspective, which is like finding non-traditional paying gigs in our space. What, and if I don't phrase things well, feel free to correct me for, industry speak or whatever it is. Like, what does a typical day look like, Gina, like for you and Whitney, for you in your career? Like, what does your job entail? What should people know going into it? What should people know that it's not when they think it's something?
Yeah, I mean, so, my official title is publishing director, which is kind of this excitingly weird, amorphous job category. Even people like within Random House are like, okay, so like, what do you do as the publishing director? There's not kind of a one size fits all, hat that goes with it. People from So basically what it means is that I run the imprint Random House Graphic, and people from various different backgrounds move up to the role of publishing director. My background is in marketing and publicity. Frequently publishers are from editorial. I know some people who've moved up from art or from sales, or, from all kinds of other divisions, from ebooks, it's kind of across the board. So as I said, so I'm responsible for the business, which means that I look at all of the things that we're doing and make sure that we're doing them in the best way possible from the first point of the season or the year or the first point of acquisition of the book to, the book getting published, the year concluding, all of those things. So I'm kind of sticking my hands into editorial, into design, into marketing and publicity, into managing editorial, who handles our scheduling and copy editing, into production, who handles our printing, into rights, who handles our foreign sales, into ebooks, into our sales department, into, different bookstores, into our work with teachers and librarians, and saying like, how is this all going? How can it go better? And then also within that, doing some specific projects in editing books, in marketing outreach, in, social media plans, and kind of things all the way across the board, depending on what things are happening and what things that are things that I would be useful at. And then another big piece of that is just looking at our parent company, Random House Children's Books, seeing where we fit into that and making sure that everything that we're doing is aligning to the way that they work. And then looking at the industry as a whole and seeing what other people are doing, what things that other people are doing that we should be doing so that we can do better, what things other people are doing that seem like a thing that we shouldn't be doing so we can differentiate ourselves, and kind of having that broad sense across the industry of kids and YA graphic novels and, what's happening with them.
Do you have a lot of freedom, and I'll get to you in just a second, Whitney, do you have a lot of freedom in like, oh, I'm seeing this trend and this is what we should be doing, to just go do it? Or is there a lot of like, you have to go and get, checks and balances?
So I would say that it depends. If I, it depends on the trend and it depends on the decision. Definitely there are decisions that we make where, what we're doing is in line with what Penguin Random House and Random House Children's Books did. So if, for example, we all of a sudden decided that we saw no other imprints were doing ebooks of their graphic novels, and we were like, we will stop making ebooks of our graphic novels. That isn't something that I could independently make a decision about without kind of involving a whole lot of people, because the standard practice at Penguin Random House is to do ebooks of every single book that the company publishes. You know, on the other hand, if I saw a trend for, you know, I'm trying to think of something silly and kind of within my bailiwick, but you know, all graphic novels that have been a success have a red element on the cover. So we need to include something that is red on every one of our covers in 2022. I mean, I think Whitney and our designer would be like, so Gina, like, let's talk about your data here. But like, if this sort of thing was like actually a thing, then, and we were like, oh, weird, that's true. All of these covers do have something red on them in, you know, a thoughtful and well integrated way. Like, let's try that out. Like that is a decision that, you know, we could kind of make unilaterally as an imprint.
That sounds like a fun kind of collaborative office. So Whitney, a day in your life editing, and especially when Gina comes to you and wants to make everything red all of a sudden.
Well, I feel like a day in the life of an editor, something that people don't talk about whenever you first start the job is how much of it is actually paperwork. There is so much paperwork because you are representing the book, and you're also the first person who like knows what the story is about, knows what who the author is, knows all this information that you need to get to other teams and other departments in the publisher at the publisher. And so there's a lot of paperwork that you have to fill out. You have to do tip sheets and a variety of different things, and also emails, and phone calls and meetings. You're keeping in touch with agents who either have a book with one of their creators, or they're hoping that you eventually get a book with one of their creators, talking to creators, going to conventions, whenever conventions are happening, and I mean, and then also just managing creator relationships, because you're working with them on their you know, amazing book that you acquired. And so a lot of that is collaboration, and it's talking with them and helping them through the process so that they're making the best version of the book as possible. And so like your job as an editor is to both help them have the support that they need to make an amazing book, but then also making that book with consideration for the company that you work for, so that you're making a book that will be successful for the company you work for, well, both for the company and for the author. And so there's a lot of balancing and a lot of give and take whenever it comes to being an editor. It's one of those questions where I feel like every time I ask it, I answer it a little bit differently, because I feel like it changes and adapts. But there's just a lot to it. It's following industry trends, seeing what's popular now, but also understanding that graphic novels take a longer time to make. So what's popular now might not necessarily be popular in 2 years. So you're trying to predict, being like, okay, so if this is popular now, what will be popular in 2023? And if I acquire this book, will that like fit the trend? And so you're kind of like, you're doing a little guesswork, being like, I hope this book will be popular, you know, in the future, that there will be a trend. But then you also kind of get to play around, where you get to see stuff that like maybe is resonating or maybe isn't resonating. Or there's like markets that haven't been filled, an audience that hasn't been reached, and you can look at books being like, well, how can I reach you to get you interested in graphic novels? And it's just kind of like, it's a lot of fun conversations. Editorial, you work a lot with the designer. So like me and Patrick Crotty, who's our designer, we talk all the time. We can't escape each other. He's the one who puts together our books and puts together the artwork. He also talks with the creators. He designs the books. He's the reason all of our books look so beautiful. And a lot of that is conversation, where it's me and him talking to make sure that like I have given him everything he needs, but it's also talking to make sure how that we're supporting our creators, you know, to make sure that we're setting up this book for success. And I feel like a lot of editorial is both extremely like isolating, because it's you and paperwork, and you don't really need anyone else to do paperwork. It's just you and paperwork. And then it's also extremely collaborative, where it's you working with different people and different teams. And so it's kind of a mix of that.
Yeah, I would say as a kid, my vision of publishing involved a lot of reading. And it does involve a lot of reading. I feel like I'm constantly reading scripts and thumbnails and inks and submissions and different passes of books. And books from other publishers so I can see what other people are doing. So like that has been true. But I do feel like communication as a skill was something I underrated as a person who was interested in coming into publishing, of how good I would need to get at email, at writing things, at talking to people, at, kind of meeting people, getting them excited about what we're doing, at doing book talks, and kind of all of this sort of back and forth. And, also the interdepartmental, like, okay, like, how do you talk to your designer about the fact that, now all the covers need to be redone to involve a red element, and, and not have them leave. I wouldn't actually do that, but like, like things like that, where there's a lot of kind of easy kind of communications that are just like, I'm checking in about this. How is this going? And then there's a lot of complicated conversations, both with authors, to be like, you're doing this thing and it could work better. And, with editorial and design also, to kind of make sure that the books are the best books possible, and to, figure out how to change things and try new things when everyone is kind of bringing their best creative self to the conversation.
That's interesting, because Whitney kind of brought that up as well, but I never had heard it from like the publisher's perspective. We had Heather Antos from Valiant, the senior editor over there, an interview.
Yeah, I know Heather.
Okay, we had her on a couple weeks ago. Okay, she's so bubbly and great, but her thing that I had never heard, and I never heard this from a publisher either, but is to not be afraid of the editor, that the editor is your best friend as a creator, I mean, because, you're thinking, oh, they just want to change my stuff, or they want to take my vision and mess it up or whatever. But in reality, and now what Gina's saying too, is like, in the end of the day, we want what's best for the book, and we want what's best for the, our imprint and the readers and everybody else involved. But that's kind of your guys' role, right? Is to talk to people, even if the discussion is hard at your level.
Yeah.
And get to a point where everything is how it should be.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the things with editorial that I spend the most of the time whenever I'm talking to creators about, like, either we're acquiring their book or like they just submitted their outline, somewhere in that stage where we're sitting there and we're talking, and I'm like, it's not my job to tell you what story to write, because I'm already interested in your story. Otherwise, we wouldn't have acquired it. Like, the reason we are working with you is because we want to see the story you want to tell. But it's also important for me as your editor to know like what your goal is, so that I can help you achieve it. But also to be there to be like, hey, so this was your goal, but now you're heading in this other direction. And so like, how can we course correct? Or if they're telling a story and it's like, hey, this is a middle grade story, but then suddenly it has like drugs, sex, and alcohol. And I'm like, so you just changed the rating, and we need to have a conversation about this because we had different expectations for what the story should be. And a lot of that is just a conversation, because the editor is supposed to be like the number one supporter. Like, we're supposed to be the number one cheerleader, but we're also the project manager. Like, we're that person who has like way too many hats whenever it comes to making a graphic novel come together. So it's one of those things being like, we're supposed to be representing the creator just as much as we're representing the imprint that we work for. And
Sure.
So it's kind of like this partnership, which is why I like how much of a collaboration it can be, especially when it comes to making graphic novels.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that is maybe easier on our end is that it is really easy as a kids publisher to be thinking about the reader, and to talk to authors about thinking about the reader also. Because for the vast majority of authors, if they're making a kids comic, the audience isn't them, because they're not 4, or they're not 8, or they're not 14. Maybe though there are some, I once worked with a 19-year-old author who was amazing. And that's Tilly Walden. She's just so good. But, really most frequently, people have this awareness coming into kids comics that what they want to do is have their work reach a reader.
Mhm.
And that makes a lot of those conversations about, how this comic is working and how, how things are coming together and how people are going to read it, less complicated than, in my personal opinion, if you're making a comic for adults where the audience is partially yourself.
Right. Right. No, that makes sense. Interesting. So it's like you're both are, and editors and publishers in general have that interest in making it the best possible version of, the original creator's vision, but also the best possible package for the reader who's going to hopefully identify with it and love it, right?
Yeah.
Nice. So actually, Gina, what had given me the idea to even want to have this talk with both of you was you were mentioning that there are jobs outside of, I say just as if you guys don't do enough, but out of editing and publishing, like non-traditional things that folks could look for jobs in with maybe less competition, maybe less known about. Can either one of you talk about what those types of jobs are?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the first one that popped to mind is production. That's a job where you work with printers and you work with like a variety of people, but a lot of it's about like uh, costing out books, figuring out page count, figuring out specs, like whether the book has spot gloss with the trim sizes. Um, and it's a job that it's one of those things where like I came from a smaller company, so it was a job that like one person had, but they had like a ton of jobs. So I was used to one person handling all that. And then like to come to Penguin Random House and it's like, here is our production department. And I'm like, interesting. This is amazing. But I feel like that's a job where people can kind of get I think it's a great job to get your first start in publishing because you learn so much about the actual books themselves and like how those books come together and like the not necessarily the creative aspect of it, but like the packaging aspect of it, which is so important to the creative aspect of it. So it's not me coming up and being like, so I told you we would have a 200-page book, but we actually have a 400-page book. That's no big deal, right? Like they're the people who can kind of like solve that problem. And yeah, that's just one job. I'm sure, Gina, do you have another one on?
Well, I mean, rights is another one. So we, as a publisher, publish graphic novels in the US, and also in Canada and the UK. Our books go to those two places also. But there's a whole lot of other countries in the world, and they all sell books. And publishers there frequently will buy US books and publish them in translation. France, Japan, Germany, Spain, the UK, Australia all have like really interesting things going on. There's also so many more countries that have really interesting things going on in their comics markets. So we have also a rights department at Penguin Random House, and specifically a few different people that we work with who take our book and talk to all of these different international publishers to say, I think this would work on your list. You should publish it in French or in Spanish or, in English, but in Australia. So they do that. And then they also, their job as a rights department involves seeing if there's a way to publish the books that we publish in the US, like not in our edition. So like if there's a, young adult literature textbook, maybe they would excerpt a chapter of one of our books. So it's their responsibility to kind of organize that. We also sell some books to Scholastic to be featured in the book fairs. And so they're responsible to talking to Scholastic and selling them Scholastic dedicated editions of our books for them to use to bring books directly to kids in schools.
Yeah.
You mentioned designer too, Whitney.
Yes.
What's that about?
So our designer is Patrick Crotty, but design as a whole, they're the people who put the book together. So it's for graphic novels specifically, they get the art files. They make sure that they're the right size, the right trim size, the right color profiles to make sure that they print beautifully. And they put the books together into basically a giant InDesign file. Which is a program, just in case people don't know what it is. It's a program you can use to build a book. But it's one of those things where, and they build it, but then they also, like Patrick, he also designs the book cover. He works with the creators on like cover ideas. He designs the spine. He designs the back cover. He takes the text that we write for copy, and then he puts it on the book and makes it look beautiful, so that it's not just like a blank page with text on top of it. It's like, here's artwork and design elements, and isn't the text even more interesting? He's like, designers are the reason when you go into a bookstore and you stop because you see a cover that catches your attention. Like, designers are the ones who make that work. And I mean, and then they can do more than that. Like, it's not necessarily just book designers, but I mean, like, but Patrick designed our logo for Random House Graphic. Other designers like marketing and publicity have their own design team that just focus on making ads and making like animated ads essentially for the books. They have and design. I feel like almost every department in some way has some sort of connection to design, because they have to, like audio has its own design team because they have to make a special cover that isn't the traditional book size cover. It's like the CD or whatever digital cover that they're going to have that's like more square shape, that you can buy online. And so they have their hands everywhere. But a lot of things, if you're interested in working in design, you typically need to have familiarity with programs that Adobe runs, so like Photoshop and InDesign, and a lot of that stuff you can learn on your own, but it's just one of those things where it is kind of important to know how to do a lot of that stuff digitally, and so that's something to keep in mind.
Okay.
And we also work with Nicole Valdez, who's our marketing and publicity manager, and she's amazing. And I feel like marketing and publicity and sales sometimes get a bad rap as far as two different parts of the industry that people think of and associate with, like people kind of like shoving stuff down your throat that you don't necessarily want. But in fact, my personal opinion is that marketing and publicity and sales don't work like that. And in fact, what they're about is connecting the books that we publish with the people who want them. And it's maybe the people don't know yet that they want them, but they are going to want them when they hear about them. There's so many people in the US. There's so many people in the US who, for example, watch television. And the book market is much smaller than that. Not all the people who are watching, the current big TV show are also picking up a book. But some of them would love those books. Like the idea of marketing is kind of identifying that, like, okay, like you love Game of Thrones because you hear about it everywhere. It's on these like street side posters, like it's just like kind of blanket all over the universe. How do we get those people who are like, I would love another dragon fantasy adventure, to know, oh wait, we have a dragon fantasy adventure and we think you would love it if you love Game of Thrones. So it's making those connections of like, you're always excited about LGBTQ books, like we publish them. And so they should be reviewed in these different outlets, and these different people should get copies to talk to the people they know personally or on Twitter, because they're kind of industry big mouths. Or these booksellers really support LGBTQ graphic novels. So like we need to get this in their hands so that they can get that front and center to the kids that they work with. Or June is Pride Month. So that's the time to be like, let's put these books front and center, because people are going to be looking for them specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the things to keep in mind is that like you see a company's Twitter and you're like laughing at something that Twitter did. There's someone who's running the Twitter. So like there's like Nicole does our Twitter. There's a variety of different things. Whenever you see something out there, whether it's like a poster of a book or media stuff like packaging and stuff you see on bookshelves to help advertise a book, like there's someone's job it was to come up with that, and it tends to touch a lot of hands. So it's like marketing came up with the idea and it went to the marketing design team, who then like put it together, who then went to like the publisher and the editor to make sure to get signed off before then it eventually like went like to production so it could get sent to a printer to be made. Like there's this whole category, though now that I'm thinking about it, there's this one other job opportunity, which is managing editorial, which tends to have our copy editors, and it's kind of twofold, where you have our copy editing team who they make sure grammar is great, they make sure all words are spelled correctly, but they also, with graphic novels specifically, like if a character is wearing a red shirt in one panel and then they're wearing a blue shirt in another panel, like they keep an eye out for those sort of elements to try to keep it consistent from page to page, and they do an amazing job. And then you have Man Ed, who kind of manage the copy editors, but then they also manage the other imprints. So like they manage editorial to make sure that we're turning in stuff on time. They manage production to make sure that they have all the information, and they've given us all the information to make sure that we can build the books to spec so that we can send them to the printers correctly and things like that. So that's just a whole another avenue of different jobs you can kind of look into.
Yeah, managing editorial is invaluable. They manage, like basically what they do is like one of their main parts of their job is they take the corporate schedule of like when things have to happen for books to come out, and for data to feed on time and all of that. And they make sure that everyone hits the dates along the process.
Okay.
So like, Whitney and I can make a schedule, like given some parameters, it's fairly easy to put together a like, okay, so when should we do this? When should we do this? So what they do is like, they give us all the corporate parameters and put together the like, okay, so like, here's what we think we should do. And so we're able to say like, okay, so this book, we have all the materials and it will be able to come out in April, versus this book where, because we don't have those last 40 pages of art and it's going to take more than 2 weeks for the author to finish them, that book will have to come out in June.
Mm-hmm. It's honestly, hearing all the different avenues there actually are, it sounds like in the most amazing way possible. It's like a candy store, like you have all these different people doing all these different functions, and they're all so intertwined and so important. That's really, really neat. So for people then, both you've touched upon trends earlier, that both of you are responsible for kind of keeping an eye on what trends might be, and to know kind of how you should market a book and where it will land. So both from that perspective of like where you think it's going, at least in the next year versus maybe 5 years, if you have any ideas on that, and also good ways for people who are seeking jobs or want to be part of the industry, to like good resources for them to be keeping their eye on what's going on and how it relates to finding a gig.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like speaking on like trends when it comes to books specifically, when in the industry, I feel like middle grade is king right now. Middle grade is what's popping. Everyone knows a middle grade book that they've read. Like, I mean, I literally read Twins yesterday and I cried and it was beautiful. But like, there's a ton of middle grade books out there, and I feel like for the trend that I think is going to happen is that these middle grade readers are going to grow older because time passes and we can't stop it. So thus they will be young adult readers soon. And so hopefully we will be seeing a boom in the young adult market, which is something that I think publishers need to keep an eye out for. What about you,
Yeah, I
Gina?
mean, this year is such a weird year.
Yeah.
With bookstores closing or doing curbside delivery, libraries doing curbside pickup, like the book market is really kind of changing as we watch and experience it. One of the things that we are seeing is that books are selling well during this time, which is awesome. It's like while we're having this like challenge and hardship, people are turning to books both for entertainment and for education. And so that's really great. It's great to look at that and kind of see that the success of books and the future of books continues on. But while we look at that, it also is an interesting challenge to predict trends when many of the ways that we traditionally get books at bookstores and libraries and schools, which are now virtual, are changing really rapidly. So I think that there's a lot of question marks here. I definitely agree with Whitney that kids' graphic novels are really popular and they're succeeding well, and that middle grade is a great strong category. It's kind of been breaking out into the categories on either side of it. So chapter books, kind of books for 4 to 8-year-olds, and YA have been growing and expanding alongside middle grade. And I'm hopeful that after those middle grade readers turn into YA readers, they'll also turn into adult readers. Because while we've been seeing new comics imprints in the kids space, I think that support for adult publishing and adult readers hasn't quite followed on at the same pace. And I'm hoping in a few years we'll see that as well. Because I also have twins on order, but sometimes I like to read books for people my age as well as books for the age of people who are 20 years younger than I am.
Something for the kind of to go on to like the industry as a whole, because this has been an interesting year, but one of the biggest conversations that have happened this year has been like the Lee and Low survey of like where diversity is in publishing, which is still a tremendously white industry when it comes to the staff that they have specifically, but then also the creators that we work with. And I feel like that's something that a lot of publishers are they've been having conversations, but I feel like that there's been a lot of outcry for actual action, and that there's going to be a change in hopefully the makeup of what a traditional publisher's staff looks like and the creators that they work with.
Yeah, diversity isn't something that I want to say is a trend, because I think what it is an actual change.
Yeah.
And who is making books, who are books for, how are we getting books to people? Our motto at Random House Graphic is a graphic novel on every bookshelf. And that means that we need to be making the kinds of stories that are for a whole different set of identities of readers. It means different ages, it means different interests, but it also means authors and readers of historically marginalized identities, queer and BIPOC people, getting the chance to work in comics and also getting to read comics that really speak to them and their personal identities and stories.
Do you think that's kind of the best way to kind of be creating that safer space for marginalized people, is basically by having more stories with and by and featuring more people like them?
Yes.
That was a poorly worded question, but thank you for picking it up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the biggest thing like with this conversation is like, how do we make spaces safer for people to tell their story and to people to tell stories that are important for them to tell? And it's by having marginalized creators, marginalized people as a whole, like on staff and representing like and working with creators and just having more representation across the board, both in-house and outside.
And like Gina said, not making it a trend, but making it the place we're
Yeah.
going to.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, were you gonna say, did I cut you off?
No.
Oh, I thought Gina was gonna say something else.
No.
So we're coming up to the end now, and we've asked all the hardball questions. One fun one. Well, you mentioned twins, Whitney, but what are each of you reading right now?
Well, so on the Random House graphic side of things, The Magic Fish is our most recent graphic novel. It's by Trung Le Nguyen, and it's the story of Tien, who's this character on the cover. And he is trying to figure out how to come out to his parents, who are immigrants from Vietnam. So they're struggling with English, and he is struggling to find the words to talk about his identity that they can understand. And it's a story about them figuring that out and coming together through fairy tales, and it's really awesome.
It looks amazing and sounds equally so.
Yeah, so there's that. And then on the other end of the scale of things with us, I also have Mika Song's Donut Feed the Squirrels, which is about these two squirrels. This one's Norma and this one's Belly. And a donut truck moves to their park, and they are like, this is the most exciting thing to ever happen to us. The donut truck does not feel the same way about squirrels, and so they have to organize a heist. So
that is delightful.
There's a whole lot of things happening in kids comics right now that are kind of all across the board, from really emotional, moving, personal stories to animal heist caper adventures, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I didn't bring props with me, so now I feel bad. I can't show you like the.
It's great for the visuals every time. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean that's like I just read I read Twins yesterday, and I feel like the one thing that's probably gotten me through the pandemic as a whole is the Shonen Jump app, which is where you can read manga on your phone, and it updates the same week it updates in Japan. So I have been reading a lot of that, and One Piece hit its 1,000th chapter this week. So I feel like there's just a variety of stories, and you can find them all over the place, whether it's bookstore, digitally, or on your phone. They're everywhere.
Nice. So then finally, can you tell me the best places for people from this audience to interact with you, whether it's your own socials or emails, or whether that's Random House or both? Let me know where you want people to interact with you.
Yeah, so our imprint, Random House Graphic, has a social media account. It's at RH Kids Graphic on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a website at rhkidsgraphic.com, and we have a newsletter there where you can sign up for updates about what's coming out from us. So I recommend that if you wish to be continually informed about all of our books. And then aside from that, personally, I'm on social media at _ Gina Gagliano. And I have in the past worked on a podcast that might be of particular interest to the Creators Assemble group, which is called Graphic Novel TK. And it's hosted on The Beat, and it outlines in hour-long interview episodes the different stages of publishing, from putting a pitch together to marketing, publicity, and sales. So if you are intrigued by this conversation and you want to know more about publishing, that's a great resource, as is the series that Whitney does on the Random House Graphic Twitter every week called Editorial Wednesday.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can find me at all those places, the imprint at everywhere that Gina said, but for me personally, you can find me at Whit Leopard. It's basically at White Leopard, just take out the E of white, so just at Whit Leopard. And I do, yeah, and then as Gina said, I do a series of tweets. I take over the Random House every Wednesday and do #editorialweds of just advice or answering questions that people send me along the way about publishing or about graphic novels or about Random House Graphics specifically. And you can find a pinned tweet on my personal Twitter that has a list of all of them.
Lovely. Thank you both so much, seriously, for being willing to take the time today. But in general, Gina, you mentioned you do volunteer work, and you both mentioned doing the podcast and everything, and answering people on social media. It's a big deal in a smallish space that a lot of people want to be in, to be willing to kind of take the time to help people figure out how they can navigate their way through here. So thank you for that. That's kind of what we're all about. And I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation with you. As for our audience, of course, creatorsassemble.org is where you can find us. Please check out our YouTube, which is where this is going to mainly live. And we will have other non-traditional jobs and different things for aspiring creatives over there. And that's pretty much it for us. So thank you so much again, both of you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.